I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is Color Between the Lines.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Joining me is Tiffany Jewell. She is an author of the #1 bestseller, The Book is Anti-Racist. This is also a teacher who's been in the profession for several years and decided to pen another book that we'll talk about today called The Anti-Racist Kid that was just released. Welcome, Miss Jewell, to the BIN.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my goodness. Please tell us what prompted you to write this book for kids, because this is a very heavy topic, as far as anti-racism, and there have been many books that have been put out by other authors, and they're usually extremely thick. This one is it's not thin because it has a lot in there, but I just want to know what prompted you to write this kind of book for kids.
There aren't a lot of books for young children in particular on the subject of racism and anti-racism. And I've been teaching young children, mostly 6 to 9-year-olds, for close to 2 decades at this point. And I'm also the mama of a 6-year-old and an 11-year-old. And so a lot of it has been like, kids over the many years have asked me these questions and they've been sitting in me, right? Because we've had these really good conversations. So this book is like kind of a compilation of all those conversations I've had with kids. Like the questions have come from all the children I've worked with over the years. And a lot of the times they have the same questions. And so kind of putting together the anti-racist kid, I was like, we need a book that like really speaks to their inquisitive, imaginative mind and their strong sense of fairness and justice. And why should we wait until they're older? Because they're young doesn't mean they can't talk about these big things, because they see it, they experience it, they know it exists. And so this book also allows for them to kind of be in on the language that we talk about, but we don't always share with young children.
Did some of this kind of also come from your own cultural background? Because you have a different, I'd like you to explain it, but your cultural background and maybe some of the questions that you had growing up.
Absolutely. So I grew up in the mid-sized city of Syracuse, New York, which I don't know if anyone knows, it's a pretty like standard mid-sized city that's got great inequities thanks to redlining and all of those misuse and abuse of power by institutions. And so my dad is Black, my mom is white, immigrant, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was really racially diverse and expansive. Our elementary school was what they call what the school district and the New York State Educational Commissioner at the time in the 1980s called racially imbalanced. So we were a school that was predominantly Black kids. And it was really great. It was really empowering. There were other kids like me and my sister who were Black biracial. And we had, all these white teachers. And a lot of times the teachers seemed to care for us and love us, but not all of them did. And I wrote about it in my other book. And in particular, I had one teacher and I was young, I was like 9, who was really kind of awful to especially like some of my darker classmates. And I knew it wasn't okay, but I didn't have the language to talk about it. And that always sat with me. And that was like my first time of being like, the adults aren't always going to care for the kids, and they're not going to always let us in on how to like talk about this. And I went home and I talked about it with my mom, and she was upset about it. And then I was like surprised that the teacher was still in the classroom the next day. I was like outraged, like, why are we supposed to feel safe? And so a lot of that kind of came from, the book came from my experiences as a kid of not having that language and feeling powerless, and hoping that other children don't feel powerless when they see and experience and witness injustice. That instead that they have the language to talk about it, and they can kind of know what to do next. Like, who do I go to? Or like, what can my friends and I do?
Yeah. Wow. I'd like you to explain for our listeners, you
Mhm.
have this book that has so many terms, prejudice, racism, minority,
Mhm.
ethnicity, culture, and you really are ultra specific about your definitions. And I really think that this is not only a good book for kids, but also for adults. Was
Thank
it
you.
difficult crafting these definitions so that they were easy for kids to digest?
Yes. Especially when you're like looking for a clear definition and you go to like the dictionaries and maybe 5 different dictionaries have 5 different explanations for something. And you are kind of like, okay, none of these are like clear enough for me to actually understand what this word means. A lot of the definitions and the glossary in the book also came from the children I worked with. So we would talk about things and then I would be like, well, how would you explain this to a first grader? Or how would you explain this to your like your little sister who's 5? And then we would like really parse it out until it was like really clear. And I think there's so much power in language. And when we kind of fill it with too many details or we don't try to make it clear, then it gets really confusing. And then everybody's talking about something different. And so I really loved, and my editor is really great at it too, because she'd be like, when we were revising, she'd be like, here on one page you say this, and on the other it's a little different. So let's like
Yeah.
make sure it's the same thing in the same place. Which one do you want it to be?
Yeah.
And it was really fun to kind of make these big concepts easily understood
Mhm.
in the language and not like using too many words to which I'm doing now but using too many words to explain something really big.
Yeah.
There's so much power in language and we forget that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, did you craft this so that it would be used like a guidebook for
Mm.
teachers so that they could help their kids or for parents, just to help
Mhm.
them teach kids so they can navigate the world today?
Yeah, I think so. It came from that. So I really like sat down at first, really centering it around children and kid readers, because I was like, like I want a kid to be able to pick the book up wherever and to find a question. Like they don't have to read it from front to back. They
Right.
can read it whenever they want to. But then it also really is for the adults. I think of like my own children and we reading it together and like we get to read a little bit and put it aside and then have a bigger conversation. And if there's something that I'm like, I need to learn more about that, I'm like, you keep reading and I'm going to do some research. Or and I loved like thinking about all the teachers and the caregivers who are like, I don't know where to start. And now I'm like, well, you can do it together. You can start here now.
Yeah, yeah. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard speaking with Tiffany Jewell. She is the author of a book called The Anti-Racist Kid that was just released. Now, I really liked how you used the illustrations in the book,
Mhm.
and you have something like an identity map in there. I thought that was cool.
Mhm.
Can you
Mhm.
describe for our listeners some of the, I guess, activities that you use to drive home some of these points that you want children to understand so that they are an anti-racist kid?
Yeah. I also like want to give a big shout out to the illustrator Nicole Miles. She's incredible. And kind of when you're writing a book, like you write the words and you maybe make some notes on what you want illustrated, but she came back with all these illustrations. And unlike my first book, the Anti-Racist Kid, there are 3 characters, Ruby, Danny, and Sean. And they're 3 kids. They're, I think, 8 and 9 years old. And I really loved kind of building their characters so all the young readers could see themselves in there. Like Ruby is biracial and she's Black and Filipina, and Danny is Taino and Seminole, and Sean is Black. He's a Black kid. And it is rare, I find, in books to see all kids of the global majority. And so that felt really exciting and powerful to be able to do that. And what they do is they kind of like they share their identity maps, which are like their way of showing who they are and the things they love. And just like any kid, even the kid who's not reading all the words will be able to see that Sean has a dog or that Danny really loves playing I think playing music. And so you get to learn a little bit, and hoping, from there, teachers or caregivers are like, we can do this too.
Right.
And I'm not like, it's not a book that's asking kids and caregivers and teachers to do homework, but it
Right.
is one that's like, think about it a little bit. And there's even like a summary at the end of each section. Like, here's some things that we, are really important for us to remember.
I really noticed how you addressed emotions
Mhm.
that children may encounter with injustice. And I think perhaps what this book teaches is kind of like the fundamentals of emotional intelligence.
Mm.
Being able to recognize what you're feeling and then giving yourself choices on how to react or take action rather to those emotions. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that part of the book?
Yeah, it's so emotional, right? Like any kind of injustice that we see or experience, like the first thing that comes up is like, for me, it's like my heart starts racing, my face gets really hot, and I feel either like I want to like push my body forward or just like stop and not move. And remembering those feelings as a kid and not being able to totally recognize what that meant. Like, why was my face getting hot at this time? Like, why did I heat up and feel like I need to take off my sweater? And now I'm hoping that, I feel like 30, 40 years later, we know more about social intelligence and emotional support and how to support each other. And children are like learning these things in school. So how can we connect that to the things that we're experiencing and seeing in the world, and to be able to kind of move your emotion from just this feeling inside to like, how can I act on this, and not like react in a way where like I'm going to regret it later, but how can I act on it? And then if I do like say the wrong thing or do something wrong, how can I repair with somebody later? So we can come and like keep working on this relationship as friends and this like creating justice together. I think that was really important to me, is to have that part of like how we can repair, because as a kid sometimes you feel I don't want kids to feel shamed at all for saying the wrong thing, because they're learning, and so that moment of repair, it's something we work on a lot in our house. And sometimes it takes a long time to repair,
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that adults need to learn that too.
Mhm, mhm.
Seriously. I imagine that this was not a book that you just quickly put together. How long did it take you to like research and organize this so that it was a complete form? And I guess what did you
Yeah.
find out that was the most difficult part about putting it together?
Yeah, writing is sometimes a very solitary thing, and so I I wasn't always sure of like, is this the right question to be putting in this place or in this book? And so um, that felt really kind of like hard. And if I feel like I've been writing this book for years, and some of it is like old teacher notes, like where this, like having to go through all my old notebooks and observations of like times, questions that the kids asked me. The research, I love researching, and it's the kind of thing I could do all the time. But the part that I have to say I loved the most was we had I think four different authenticity readers read through the like first few drafts of the book. And they had all these different, intersecting identities that were represented in the book and not. And they're all folks of the global majority. And it was such a collaborative team. And their input and the things that they shared, like of their own information and knowledge, was incredible. And to have them like their sharing was just like, I'm so grateful to the authenticity readers, and I hope like any author who's listening, and I hope that you can like listen and learn from the authenticity readers too.
Oh well, I see that you have it on Amazon where you can
Mhm.
get it electronically, and I think you have audiobook too. I
Yeah.
think that's really
Yeah.
cool that you're able to listen to the book as well. So then you get that's another whole experience when you listen to a book versus reading a book.
I love audiobooks, and I've found that nonfiction books and audiobooks are like the perfect combination for me. It's how I learn best. Channy Waits is the narrator, and her voice is so soothing. And so she takes these like, these big concepts that I've written down and makes them feel really attainable and doable. And you feel really good listening to her voice too.
What, I guess, is the final question? What is the big takeaway that you hope that folks will pick up when they pick up this book?
Yeah, I think I really want folks to know that anti-racism is like the goal. It's not this like thing that isn't attainable or anything, because it is, because we're actively working for justice and we're doing it together, and kids can do this. And I really want the adults who read the book to know that the children can do this, and we can do it with them, but we have to do our own work on the side, because kids are, they're learning while we're like unlearning and relearning and doing all of this stuff. But the kids are ready. They're so ready to take on the work of justice. So we have to make room for them.
I love it. Thanks so much, Tiffany Jewell, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks you for having me. I'm so excited.
That does it for this edition of Color Between the Lines. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.